So thank you so much to the organizers for, of course, funding our research, but also setting this workshop up and placing our paper after Petra's, because it's really inspired by her work you just showed. It has recently changed the title to the Lost Ester Boserups. I'll tell you a bit about her. She's a very outstanding academic from Denmark who had a very influential research career and was the mother of 3. This project started with 3 women on the project. 1 left academia and 1 became a mom. So it's really a paper about our lives. So I'll share the floor with Ria. I'll speak the first half of the presentation. So we want to start with this quote from the Nobel laureate in medicine from last year, who said, after graduation, as soon as women give birth and become mothers, they fall behind and they don't end up in leadership positions. So we want to test this statement. Is this true in economics? So our motivation is very close to Petra's. So despite of women being enrolled in graduate school in economics for decades, women remain underrepresented as faculty. So across Europe, women constitute 26% of economists with tenure, but amongst junior researchers, this gender gap is smaller. And in the US and also in the UK, these gender gaps are larger. The career structure in academia emphasize high productivity early in the career, and for the majority of people, this coincides with fertility. And we know from a lot of research now that the main driver of gender inequality in the broader labor market is driven by children, at least in middle and high income countries. So that sort of naturally leads us to a research question. So we want to understand what are the effects of parenthood on men and women's economic careers in economics. So we are going to answer this question in a more recent setting than what Petra is doing. So we are going to do this in more like the current cohorts in Denmark. So Denmark is a small, rich country not far from here, where women's representation among faculty is lower than the continental European average, but slightly higher than the US and the UK. So we are going to use administrative data, meaning that we have the full population of people enrolling in a PhD in economics in Denmark, and we can follow them from the onset of their career. So that's we define as the onset of the career as enrolling in a PhD. We link the labor market information with family outcomes. And then what's unique to this project is that we have publication data matched to the administrative data as well. So we can also investigate changes in research productivity, and we can also show some patterns on selection into the publication database. We have collected data on collective bargaining since the mid-90s, so we can use this in combination with earnings from the administrative data to infer the position of a researcher. If they earn more than the minimum wage for their position, we are going to say that they have tenure if they earn more than the associate professor minimum wage. Yeah, so what we find, I think for me at least, I really got some priors changed with this project. So we don't find any differences in parenthood patterns across men and women. 10 years after enrolling in the PhD, men and women are equally likely to be parents, and they also have the same number of children. And there's also, when we compare academics, so people who stay in universities or sort of broader research, think tanks and public research institutes, they don't have lower fertility compared to people who left and went to industry. What we see when we combine the administrative data with the publication data is that parenthood precedes the first publication for the vast majority of people in our sample. And we can see, and we'll show you in much more detail, that those who manage to publish before parenthood, they're really very different than those who publish after parenthood. And this is more true for women than for men, because women become mothers 2 years earlier than men become fathers. So of course, we are also estimating child penalties, and we show that following parenthood, both men and women are leaving universities, but men are more likely to move into the broader research sector, so public research institutes, for example, while women, they leave research completely. We have a bit of heterogeneity, so we show that women who are out-earned by their spouse or have a spouse that take very little parental leave, they have larger penalties, so they're more likely to leave academia altogether. And we find a short-term gender gap in the likelihood of being promoted to associate professor. And across specifications, we actually don't find any child penalties in publications. And even when we condition on publication in our specification where we are interested in promotion gaps, controlling for publication do very little or actually nothing at all to the promotion rates. Yes. So this paper is contributing to two strands of the literature. So there is a literature on research productivity and gender gaps. As I said in the beginning, there's high returns to early career productivity. And sometimes in this literature, people refer to a productivity puzzle, saying that even within a field, there are gender differences in publication frequency. And part of this has been linked to children. And as Petra just showed, like quite direct evidence of is like a decline in productivity for women following marriage and parenthood. So besides Petra's work, a paper that's closely related to ours is the work by Tatari and co-authors, also using Danish data on a publication on publishing researchers in STEM, so we can compare our estimates to theirs as well. So we can, in that way, compare economics to the broader STEM. We also contribute to the literature on women in economics, so it's been showed many times that there are persistent gaps in tenure rates, and there's also really different working environments for men and women in the profession. So women are more likely to face discrimination and harassment and lack support of and role models. The paper most closely to ours is this paper on the gender-neutral tenure clock extension at top US departments. And some of our patterns are actually aligned with what they find. So you think that Denmark would be very different, like the Danish academic environment would be very different from the top of the profession, but a lot of our patterns are actually fairly similar, I would say. So our main contribution is that we can directly observe parenthood on the full universe of PhD students in Denmark, and we can estimate the role of children. And our main outcome of interest is staying in academia and getting tenure. So by including all PhD students, we overcome an important source of survivorship bias, so we don't need to rely on making it into a publication sample or making it onto a faculty roster or participating in a survey. And we are going to show you these gender differences in making it into these samples. So some details on Denmark. So Denmark is a small country. We only have 8 universities. They are all public. 4 of them have economics departments. Of course, economists can work in other departments than economics departments, and they would still be in our data if they work in the finance department or public health. But there's only few workplaces for academic economists. PhD students in Denmark are enrolling in a PhD after a 2-year master in a relevant field, and a PhD programs they're 3 years long. It's only fairly recent that Danish departments started to hire on the market. So if we look at the professor in Denmark, they are mainly Danes with PhDs from Denmark, while assistant professors are more diverse. Earnings for both faculty and PhD students are set in collective bargaining, so basically everybody earns the same. So for PhD students, there's fairly generous scholarships where people earn roughly the same as junior civil servants, and a new assistant professor earns 67,000 euros a year. Both faculty and students have the right to paid parental leave, and the rules for this is also set in collective bargaining. So leave for up to 11 months is compensated at the levels of unemployment insurance or longer, and any duration of parental leave will lead to an extension of any temporary contracts. So this is the case for PhD students, postdoc, and assistant professors. If they take half a year of parental leave, their contract will be extended with half a year. Yeah, and Denmark also has subsidized daycare, making it both affordable and available for children when they are half a year old, and the vast majority of Danish kids, they go to daycare when they are 10, 11 months old. Before you say this is Denmark, this is so weird, we cannot believe in these estimates for anybody else. I will say in general, there's very little correlations between globally between female labor force participation and women in science. So the policies that we normally have in mind that might help women in the labor market more generally are probably not the same policies that's going to help women who have invested a lot in human capital. So here I'll just highlight or like explain that women have been present in economics in Denmark for many, many years. The first woman to get a master degree in economics in Denmark was in 1893, Meta Hansen, who went on to have a career in Statistics Denmark, and also Ester Boserup, who lent her name to our paper, got a master degree in the 1930s and went on to have a very impressive academic career. Yes. Okay. Okay, yeah. 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 Okay, yes, I agree. That, yeah, it could also be that some of our results are unique to Denmark or a similar setting. Yeah. 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 Okay, absolutely. Yeah, so what I show in this graph is the evolution of women in different positions. So maybe you don't see the graph so clearly, but the solid red bar is the share of women who have PhDs, who graduate with PhDs, growing from roughly 20% in the 80s and 90s to 40% for more recent cohorts. And the yellow line are the share of women who are publishing, so showing up in our Scopus data, also growing over time. And the dash bar that you see in the bottom are the share of women who we classify as professors, growing from below 10% in the mid-2000s to 20% today. And so our sample is not completely overlapping with departments of economics, but still today there's 12 women who are professors in economics when we go to the faculty web pages out of approximately 90 professors. So the female representation at the top of the profession in Denmark is very low. Yes. Yeah, so we did look at the year, so we can see if they leave the Danish population, and there was no gender differences in this. It's not that common, and the years spent outside Denmark for people who leave for just 1 or 2 years, that's a bit longer for men, but those who completely leave and don't show up back in the Danish admin data, there's no gender differences in this. But it seems like men are more likely to leave for a postdoc abroad and then come back. Yeah. So I'll move on to the data. So since the early 80s until fairly recent cohorts, we have the educational, the highest achieved education that a person has. We know where they work, and we are interested in whether they work at universities, the broader research sector, or any other sector. We know their earnings, and we know the family outcomes. So that's specifically the timing of children and the characteristics of the co-parent. We have collected this data on centralized bargaining from the academic unions from the mid-90s. So for each position, that's PhD students, assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor, we know the earnings floor. So in combination with earnings, we can infer the position of the researchers. Yeah, and postdocs earn the same as assistant professors in Denmark. And then we have merged with Scopus data as well. So Scopus is an archive of academic papers. So we don't have working papers in this data, but we have the number of publication, and we can also adjust for quality using the journal impact factor or the citations in the years following the publication. So the way we define economist is a person who enroll in a PhD and have a master degree in a relevant field, because we don't observe the faculty that the PhD is in, but we can see if a person has a master degree in economics, math and economics, statistics, resource and environmental economics, or business economics. So if you have a master degree in one of these fields and you enroll in a master, then you're in a sample. So this gives us a sample of just below 1,700 people, of which 1/3 are women. This one thing that surprised me is actually that a large share of people have children already before they start the PhD. And so then on these people, we cannot estimate a child penalty. And we also need them to have a child before the end of our period. So we end up estimating on a very small sample. The benefit of this sample is that we can focus on the early career stage and we can overcome survivorship bias, but there's a limitation as we are excluding people with PhDs from abroad. So to overcome this, we are using Scopus to create a different sample where we say if a person has ever published in economics according to Scopus and they have resided in Denmark, they can be in our sample. So with this definition, we get 1,062 people, again, 1/3 are women. But to estimate child penalties, we need to condition on publishing before parenthood, as publishing after parenthood is, of course, also an outcome. So then we end up with a tiny sample of 303 people. So here are some descriptive statistics. I just want to highlight a few numbers. So this is split by degree and by gender. And what you see here is that while our sample is 32% women, when we look only in economics, this is the field, or this is the master degree with the lowest share of women. So in statistics and in economics and math, the share of women are substantially higher. I'll also highlight that on average, women in our sample are younger, so like 3 years later that they enroll in the PhD. And this is, of course, a feature of women being more and more represented in economics. So this is our first set of results. So here I show you a table showing you for men and women 5, 7, and 10 years after enrolling in the PhD, how many of them have at least one child and how many children do they have? And what I've highlighted in yellow are 10 years out. So academics have the same, as likely to have, or even more likely to have kids compared to those who leave and go to industry. And this is true for both men and women. I don't know if you can read it, but so women who are in university, 78% of them have at least one child, while those who work outside, that's the same number, but for men, there is a difference. So those who stay at universities, 79% of them have at least one child, while those who work in industry, only 64% of them have kids. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so we don't really have this teaching track to the same extent. So we are capturing everybody who works at university. So we are, for example, also capturing management. So it's employment at the university. So that has some drawbacks, of course. I think what you are describing, I think the notion in Denmark have been that women are moving into these broader research sector because they are a bit less demanding. I think that's the interpretation, so that people move out of universities and then into these other occupations. Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, I mean, yeah, maybe we could do a combination of like staying publishing and working in universities to get at this. Yeah, yes. Yeah, so it has changed in more recent years. It's similar to other academic jobs where it's like a 6-year up or out, but it used to be more permanent contracts that were offered. Yeah, but this has also changed, but fairly recent, so we can't use this source of variation. Yeah, right. So one gender gap that that does exist in this data is that women in academia do have children earlier than men. So if you look at the 5-year column, women are more likely to have a child 5 years after starting the PhD. We have some results that I'm not going to show you, but so parenthood doesn't influence graduation rates, and it doesn't influence the likelihood of ever publishing. Those who get a child during the PhD, those women are 0.8 years delayed, but I mean, that's the maternity leave, but that's the only gender difference that we find. Yes, so we are running an event study estimate. I'm sure at least some people in this room know the specification very well. So we are pooling men and women simply because of power. So we interact the year to parenthood with gender to get the gender gap. So we are interested, of course, both in the parenthood penalty to see if there's an effect both for men and women, and then also a gender gap. So we include the year since PhD enrollment instead of age, but all our results are robust to doing age instead. And then we also have just a dummy for gender, capturing initial differences across men and women. And we have a year trend capturing, or like a year dummies to capture general changes in the academic environment. As an alternative specification, we are pooling the years before parenthood and the immediate years and the years sort of in the medium run to get more precision. Yes, and I'll hand over to Ria now, who is going to show you our event studies.
Thank you. Here, so you can hear me. So yeah, as Anne Sophie said, I'll show you some of our event studies on the basis of the 2 different samples and the different outcomes. Can you see this well? Okay, the colors look slightly different on my screen, but I hope you can see the differences between the blue and the red. We unfortunately use the slightly generally stereotypical that the women confidence intervals are shown in the light pink and the men in the light blue. Is it visible? Or yeah, okay, great. So what we see here is the effect of parenthood on overall working in research. So what we see that previous to the event of having children, we see similar patterns or pre-trends among men and women, and we see them starting to separate after the year of parenthood. So we see that actually the pink, the women tend to have a lower likelihood of working overall in the whole research sector following childbirth. So the average estimates in the first 2 or 3 years vary around 10 to 12 percentage points as compared to the pre-period before, and then tend to sort of stagnate around that time. So the similar estimates are around 3 to 5 years after parenthood. So for men, so also we can compare this to sort of the relative chance. So kind of the baseline probability of working in the broad sector of research following, let's say 5 years after enrollment into the PhD would be around 50%, around 45%. So we see that the relative magnitude of this estimate is quite high at around 20% for women. For men, on overall, we see a relatively stable pattern that it's not statistically significant, but if anything, the estimates vary around 2 to 4 percentage points, a lower likelihood of working overall in the research sector. Okay, so then what we do is we separate this across universities and across the broad research sector. So I think you can think about sort of the broad research sector typically as working, for example, at the Rockwell Foundation, which maybe some of you have heard. That is something that you see on the left-hand side, and working at university as an outcome, so kind of being maybe a more classical academic, as we could imagine, kind of working at maybe Copenhagen University or Aarhus University, is shown on the right-hand side. So what we see is that actually for universities, parenthood on average lowers the likelihood of working in university for both genders equally. So there is a slight pattern, but the confidence intervals for both men and women overlap. So on average, I think it's about men and women are 5 percentage points less likely to work at universities following parenthood. However, what we see kind of, and where the result probably is more driven, is that for the broad research sector, there's a larger gap of men and women. So actually, what happens is that men tend to, after parenthood, after becoming dads, men move into this broad research sector or are likelier to work there, while women leave altogether. So there's around 10 to 15 percentage points lower likelihood of working in this broader research sector following parenthood. Yeah, I see 2 hands up. Maybe I saw this one first.
Yeah, just a quick question to understand the context better. So the broader research sector, is that the sector that produces the more high quality research, or can you not generalize, or is it more universities? Just to understand if there's some sort of specialization into the different sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you could think about, for example, universities as being sort of it depends. I wouldn't want to make quality implications of the two, but I think in the UK context, universities would be kind of typical LSE, Queen Mary, University College London. The broad research sector, for example, would be IFS. That would be the equivalent. So in Denmark, again, for example, if you work at the Rockwell Foundation, you would be working in the broad research sector. Yeah, does that help? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you wait for the microphone? I'm so sorry, people like that.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I'm coming back to my earlier question, no? That there is this evidence for the US of sorting of women into these, you know, non-research jobs within universities. So I was wondering, and then, you know, if you are also including administrative jobs, because administrative jobs in universities are mostly done by women. So it's in the US, in the UC system data, the baby gap shows up only in the tenure track jobs. So I think it's crucial that you separate within the university's employment these 3 categories: administration, like, you know, just teaching jobs with the more high-profile research tasks. I don't know if you can do that with your data.
We can't. I mean, a couple of considerations to have in mind is that we require them to have a PhD and work at the universities, and we can track who published or not. So those 3 things together basically means that we're not really capturing administrative jobs at the university. There would be very few, like, I think, positions that they might be like top management of someone who would have a PhD and work at the university in administration. So I think really kind of when you're looking at the outcome of universities, I think it's mostly overlapping exactly sort of the idea of the tenure track.
I mean, I guess the issue is that, you know, women get PhDs, they might publish, but after having children, they move into these, you know, teaching jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of that. I think Anne Sophie sort of answered is that up until recently in Denmark, you could continue still working at sort of an assistant professorship level. So your job wouldn't be like cut off necessarily. And we can see those individuals. So I think that's actually best going to show up when we look at, which is I think the next or the 2 slides, the effect on tenure. So there we can discuss that in that context as well. If that makes sense. Yeah. But we can also, which we haven't particularly done, but because I think there's very few academics that work part-time, but we can, for example, look at whether I don't know, whether there's a higher chance of moving into working in a university and being part-time, for example. From memory, again, I doubt that would be the case just because very few people take up part-time jobs. But we can't separate exactly in the data whether you are like on the, I know that LSE now has like a teaching track and hires, for example, one person, I think as a teaching fellow. I don't think we can see that exactly in the data. Okay. Thank you. You're giving context. Okay, so I think these two kind of graphs combine what you've seen previously, is that on average we do see that women tend to leave research more, but this is primarily driven with this altogether broad research sector, while both parents or all parents tend to leave universities as well. Okay, I think there's it's important to kind of think about what potentially could be driving that, and whether there is any heterogeneity that it could be interesting to see what could kind of lead women or men more likely to stay in academia. So our data is quite generous and allows us to investigate some of these potential, as we call it, sources of support. Now, theoretically, you could think about kind of demand side factors and supply side factors. So I think demand side factors, and I think that's also a really important consideration for policy, we can think about them at the maybe institutional level. So empirically, you could think about whether there's like department fixed effects that drive the variation, for example, women staying after parenthood. On that end, we could, for example, separate different types of tenure bars. Okay, thanks. Different type of tenure bars, whether it's a high or low, or for example, whether generally having more women on the faculty drives women to, or kind of makes this a more friendly environment and is likelier to attract women. However, I want to kind of separate, while it would be great to investigate that, we've tried to look at this, but we're not very good, even though the data is very detailed, we're not very good at differentiating departments in our data. So it's hard to sort of separate whether for example, someone is working within like economics or the business, for example, department. So we don't investigate that currently. If you find it interesting, please tell us in the break and we can maybe invest a lot of time in doing this better. However, what the Danish administrative data does allow us is to look at maybe supply side factors better. So this is something that would drive differentially men and women into choosing or sort of pursuing this high stake environment maybe. And what we can do there is we do two things really. We look at couples or sort of the opposing partner of the academic, and we look at whether or not the woman or the man is a breadwinner or they're more equal on the basis of their earnings. So if in the year prior to parenthood, the woman earns 40 to 60% of the household income, we define it as an equal couple. If it's lower than 40%, then it's a male breadwinner. If it's higher than 60%, then it's a female breadwinner household. So we do that. And then we also try to kind of maybe look at differential norms that could be within a couple. So and we proxy that by the take-up of parental leave. So we split it by the median. If the man takes higher than the share median of men, which is 11% in Denmark, or 12%, I think, then we characterize that as a more progressive couple. If it's less than the median share of parental leave, we categorize that as a more traditional couple. And what do we find that there's a lot of numbers on this, so maybe you can just kind of zoom into the highlighted parts. Is that generally the couples that are more traditional, so either the male is a breadwinner or the men use less than the median level of parental leave, we find that those are for those women, the gaps are even higher, or there's a higher chance of leaving academia or leaving the broad research sector altogether. Okay. And as I've kind of mentioned this, so we can look at the effect of parenthood of tenure. We proxy this with kind of a salary that's equivalent of being an associate professor or higher, or a full professor in Denmark. And what we see is that kind of after parenthood, there kind of emerges a gender gap. So women are less likely, around 10, on average 10 percentage points, less likely to become professors or become tenured after becoming parents. And this is not really, this effect is not present for men. And then I think if you kind of want to compare it to some baseline probability, on average, about 10 years after enrollment into a PhD, about 30% of researchers are tenured or at the associate professor. So this gap of like 8 to 10 percentage points relatively is very high. And also kind of, you might ask whether or not that's sort of conditional on staying or not. So even if we condition on staying, this gap exists. The gap is smaller, but it still exists. Okay, great. And another kind of perhaps important question is this unique to economics? So there was already a couple of questions, I think in the previous presentation that we're sort of asking, and I think that's maybe the policy question that we're interested in. Is economics particularly bad in terms of some institutional characteristics? So what we do here is we also we show these same outcomes working in research, tenure, and universities. And promotion here is tenure at the bottom. For overall social sciences being a good proxy for maybe similar fields to economics that might have, that in general at least recently didn't have tenure bars or tenure specific clocks. So the social sciences you can think about as being political science, sociology, business, and so on. And we see that there is still sort of pretty wide confidence interval, but there is a tendency for both parents to kind of be less likely to receive tenure and less likely to stay in research. However, we don't find gender gaps. And I think that's sort of, especially if you zoom into, for example, working in research, which is on the top left corner, and tenure, which is on the bottom right corner. If you remember my previous graph, for example, for tenure, there was a gender gap emerging after parenthood. But when we look at all other social sciences, we don't see this effect. So it is, at least in Denmark, still seems to be something about economics. Okay, thanks. And then as Anne Sophie said, we look at publications. So this was as a measure of research productivity. And interesting enough, we don't find any effects on publications. So if we look at 3 different measures of research productivity that are kind of widely used in the literature, namely the publication count, which is just the number of publications a researcher has every year, then adjusted for its quality or where it's published, and then finally adjusted for the number of publications all the way to the right. We see that the confidence intervals tend to be large, but we don't find any statistically significant effect on these. So we can discuss maybe in the break why this could be happening. And we have some ideas, but yeah, we do not find any effect on research productivity. Okay. Also, which is maybe intuitive, since we don't find an effect as well, if we do condition, for example, if we're interested in the effect on tenure, going back to the gender gap that I showed you in tenure, which is relatively pretty high among men and women, if we decide to condition on publications, just to see, for example, kind of to counteract some of the stereotypes about men and women publishing, even we can kind of in the 5th, 6th, and 7th column again, we condition on the publication count and the 2 quality measures of publication. We don't see that this affects the gender gap that we estimate on tenure. So the gender gap remains. And finally, I'm going to speak a bit quickly about selection. So just sort of here now we use the sample of researchers, right? So this is now the sample of active researchers who show up in the Scopus data. It's different than the existing administrative data. And I think the condition here that we make is that we need to observe individuals publish before they have before they become parents. But the advantage of this is that we can also capture academic economists that didn't do their PhDs. So here, in this sample, which is slightly different, we don't find any child penalties in promotions. So if we just define our sample based on active researchers, which sort of aligns to existing work, we don't find any gap. And I want to spend a bit of time finally talking about like particular ideas of selection. Selection with respect to other kind of existing literature. So as Anne Sophie said, we were kind of very much inspired by Petra's work starting this paper, but existing findings in general tend to, including like Kim and Moser, Iaria and Tatari and so on, they tend to focus on an active set of researchers. So individuals who are already employed at universities. And for example, in these papers, there is kind of there is findings that this is a very selected group of individuals already. So for example, in the Man of Science, as we've just seen previously, the women that end up there and women that become mothers are on average much less likely to become mothers and tend to be positively selected. So what we want to do is try to basically see this, because we can exactly compare in the same time period all the population data as compared to the active Scopus, active researcher data. And what we see that a priori, there is no differences in fertility and publishing. But I think sort of as I see that 1 minute is left, I just want to pinpoint to two measures that we want to sort of discuss and be happy to hear your comments later on. Is we use high school GPAs to try to think about sort of a measure of quality among those researchers who end up surviving or who end up being in the Scopus data set and actually publishing. And I think kind of very briefly, if you see kind of moving from the left-hand figure to the right-hand figure, in our PhD sample, the kind of educational measure of educational quality seems to be relatively similarly distributed among men and women. So that's the full left-hand side. Well, if you zoom into the full right-hand side, this is now everyone who has done a PhD in our sample, but also enters the publishing and publishes before parenthood. So this would be the sample that most papers so far have used. In this sample, we see that if you look at women are very positively selected on their GPAs in high school. So this is obviously we can discuss how good this measure is, but we see that women tend to be kind of tend to be different than men. So both men and women are a bit, or parents, both men and women parents are positively selected, but women even more so than men. And I think, and finally, this has implications sort of with who we look at when we estimate just these differences on active researchers. And last point is that this particularly, for example, I think it's clear if you look at the bottom age of parenthood. So I think within our sample, sort of, if we look at from the beginning of entering potential academia, so from starting your PhD, the distribution of age looks like the bottom right-hand figure. So this is how it's distributed. A lot of men and women also have children before they're 30 over this period in Denmark. But if we just condition and observe the individuals in the Scopus database, so the sample of researchers who are actively publishing before parenthood as well, we see that the distribution looks very different. So we capture people that, both men and women, who are older, who become parents when they're older, and particularly women. So, yeah, that's it. So finally, I think just to maybe, I'm not going to repeat all the findings just in the interest of time, but maybe just to kind of the main things I guess we find is that there is a gender gap in the likelihood of tenure following parenthood, and then women are likelier to leave the broad research sector while both parents leave universities. And I think it's important, I think, since we're today as well, to think about potential implications of our research at least. And I think we would say that, first of all, there is definitely parenthood doesn't explain the full underrepresentation of women in academic jobs at Denmark. It could explain a bit of the associate professor or higher, but doesn't explain the whole underrepresentation. But also, especially if you look at our finding that the tenure, it's specifically less likely for women to be granted tenure just after parenthood. I think one potential policy implication could be to think about whether or not it's a good idea that the timing of tenure tends to now overlap with fertility specifically. And specifically as that is getting kind of, as women are sort of, as like the process of being granted a PhD with like pre-docs and a longer PhD, and the job market and postdocs tend to be later and later. So the two things tend to be overlapping more and more. And yes, apologies, and thank you for your attention. And
thanks, Anne and Ria. We've got time just for one question, just to fix the break. So
Thanks, that was really interesting. You said women leave leave universities and also the research sector, but I wondered where they go.
Okay, great. We have a slide for that.
Also, while you're bringing that up, whether you can use the Danish paternity leave reform, the recent one, to look at whether that is responsible for what you see in terms of the closing of the gap in publications.
Should I take the two or just answer? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Sonia. Yeah.
Super interesting. So I was wondering whether you have enough power to identify whether the organization of research with many co-authors or in teams makes a difference. There are several reasons for that. I mean, it seems that, you know, we kind of know that substitutability matters for women outcomes from other settings. And also, I think we also know that sometimes when there are more co-authors, women get discounted. So that could also maybe speak to the tenure decision. So do you have this variation in the data?
Great, thank you. I think the first question was where are the women going to? And then here we just have a bit of a rough table of where both women and men are going to. So I think for women are likelier than men, for example, to leave to the public sector and admin. So this would be, I think, considered, for example, working in the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Taxation, Ministry of Economy, or things like that in Denmark. And then obviously there's consultancy, pharmacy as well, pharmaceuticals, and so on. Men more likely to go to, for example, other financial sector if they leave academia. So I think that was one of the questions. Then it was on parental leave. So I think Anne Sophie is the expert on that, or like my expert at least on parental leave. I'm not sure we would have enough power to do that, or at least not at this very point in time. We have thought about it. One thing that we didn't discuss is that we can separate, because we have around 40 years of data, specifically kind of very good data in the past 20 years. And we can separate across generations, and we find that these gaps are larger in the older cohorts. So there could be various things that are happening there, but they're larger in the older cohorts before the reform. And someone asked about co-authors as well. We do see this. We see this in the Scopus data. So we exactly see who someone co-authors with and whether this is permanent. I guess because we didn't find an effect on publications overall in the first instance, we didn't go down that route. But you're absolutely right that there's a lot of like other research, like Sarsens, for example, et al, that show that this could matter. So maybe an idea specifically how we could use this would be useful. But yes, we do have the data for those that publish. Yeah. Okay,
that's
thanks.
great. Thanks to both sets of presenters.